Good evening, everyone. We are so glad to see everyone here this evening, and especially to welcome Dr. Hecker back. His lectures are always so informative, so we're very glad that he is back. Before we begin, I just want to give you a little bit of information about where we are with the Oppenheimer House. The Historical Society acquired the house a couple of years ago. We had a complete evaluation. And our 94-year-old beauty does need quite a facelift, including we will need to redo all of the electrical, so we don't have fuses with copper pennies anymore. Updating the mechanical, new plumbing, eventually a new roof. And what we're focusing on right now is the structure of the house. In order to fix the foundation, we will have to take up every single board in the hardwood floor, dig out dirt, and then we need to put around the perimeter a wall of concrete along with some helical piers. So this is a very expensive adventure, as you can imagine, and it is something that is important to each and every one of you, as well as the Historical Society. That house and J. Robert Oppenheimer are the reason that you and I are here, that we get to do what we do, that we live in this community, that the lab is here, and it all goes back to the Manhattan Project coming because of that Boys Ranch community and the Oppenheimer House. So it's important for all of us to preserve it, to tell its story. Now, some of you may not realize, but the Hans Beta House and the Oppenheimer House do not belong to the county. They are not lab property. They belong to the Historical Society. And as a nonprofit, we have to look for different sources to take care of our properties. This evening, when you came in, you got a little card. There's information on here of how you can contact the Historical Society, how you can make a donation, and we even have a QR code that you can use. And again, if you have any questions, you can always ask us, but that's where we are with our 94-year-old gem. Now at this time, I would like to give the microphone to our Executive Director, Todd Nichols, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sherry. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out tonight. I see a lot of folks here tonight that have attended SIG's lectures over the years, so thank you again for supporting us in the lecture. I first met Mr. Hecker when I was in 5th grade, when he brought his daughters to Mesa School when I was in 5th grade and enrolled them. And that was actually, Lois Bradbury was our teacher, which was great. Then later on, when I worked with the laboratory doing some photography, I was able to produce some imagery for some of his talks. And now I would like to just go ahead and introduce Dr. Sig Hecker.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a great pleasure to be back here, see so many of you, and then particularly to pay tribute to one of the best couples that Los Alamos has ever known, and that is Laurie and Alice Mann. And as you know, Laurie passed away some years ago, back in September of 2017. He had invited me for years before to give talks, typically at the Mormon Church. And then since he passed away, I kept giving talks until the pandemic hit. And so the last one I gave was actually almost exactly 3 years ago in 2020, before the pandemic hit. Alice, let me give tribute to you. If you don't mind, just if you could stand up for a second so we can pay tribute to one of Los Alamos' favorite. So I'm here tonight to talk about North Korea, and particularly to talk about my book, which has been in a long time coming, and I actually have a copy in my hand. Todd wasn't quite able to get a number of copies here, but I'll come back and he will arrange to have sort of book signing and a more private discussion about other things that you might be interested in on North Korea after you listen to today's talk. And so what I want to cover, what the book covers, is how did we get from essentially 0 nuclear weapons in 2000 to where today North Korea has a threatening nuclear arsenal. And that's the story of Hinge Points. And I mentioned I've been working on it for 4 or so years. I wrote it with a former student and then subsequently research assistant, Elliot Serban, who's actually off now at Harvard University, getting a JD and a master's in international relations. And so what I thought I would do is to give you a brief tour through the book. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover it in great detail, but what I thought I would do is see if I could answer these questions and sort of engage you the way that I actually wrote the book. And so I'll walk through that. But, you know, in the end, if you really want to know the answer to that question, how in the world did North Korea do this, you'll have to read the book. Now, as it turns out, you know, I once upon a time thought, you know, you might make money when you write a book. Let me tell you, forget it. You know, by the time the publishers get through with you, it's probably to the tune of a couple of cents an hour that I've put into this. But it's really a labor of love. So, how did I get to North Korea? Well, there is one single person that was responsible for that, and that was Stanford professor John Wilson Lewis. And I knew John because we had many interactions related to nuclear issues around the world. When he was at Stanford, I was at Los Alamos. And in late 2003, I was still at Los Alamos, no longer director. And John called me up and he said, "Sig, I need you to come to North Korea with me." I said, "John, I don't want to go to North Korea." You know, been to Russia by that time some 30 times. I've been to China, I've been to all of these other places that have nuclear things, but North Korea was not on my list to visit. But John was known for great persistence, and so I told him, "Well, look, John, I'll tell you what, you'll see if you can get me in." And I thought for sure on the US end, I was still at Los Alamos, as I mentioned, I'd have to get, you know, clearance to go to North Korea. Somebody in Washington would have to approve. And then once the North Koreans find out who I was, you know, former director of Los Alamos coming into North Korea, surely one of the two would say no. Well, it turns out I was wrong, and I wound up in North Korea in January of 2004. And it was an incredible visit in so many different ways, particularly just even setting foot in North Korea. It wasn't what I expected. And so, for example, the first day when we got to North Korea, this is what I found. This was January 6th, and there were Christmas decorations. You know, not only, as you can see here with the Christmas trees, but even here, you know, the stencils on the windows and everything is one of my colleagues who actually joined us. He, at that time, was working for Senator Richard Lugar. His name was Keith Luce. So I found that, and as we went around Pyongyang, we found lots of interesting things. There were playgrounds for children everywhere. There were children in many, many places. I've been told that when you go to North Korea, the kids won't even look at you It wasn't true. They smiled. I saw many of them. And then we also went to the market. And I never expected to see a market like this. And in fact, when I came back and I showed my wife Nina these photos, she looked at those tomatoes and she said, I can't find those at Smith at Los Alamos in January. You know, and you found them in Pyongyang. So there was lots of activity. And then, of course, the main reason that we went at that time is to go to the nuclear center. And that is, John Lewis had been to North Korea 8 times before this particular visit. And he was sort of a non-governmental interlocutor with the North Koreans. He had first worked with the Chinese, then with the North Koreans. And indeed, what John had found is that our government really didn't know how to deal with North Korea. And in the late 1980s, 1990s, around the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, North Korea started to come out of its shell, and John was one of these people who was able to interact with them. So they had shown him around much of North Korea. He interacted with the diplomats, but of course he'd never been to the nuclear center. When they told him they're going to bring him to the nuclear center, that's when he invited me. And so we did wind up at the nuclear center. And it was absolutely incredible in terms of what they actually showed us as we went through this nuclear center. And particularly what was important at that time, so by this time now we're in January of 2004, the way that the politics had gone. In 1994, President Clinton signed a deal with the North Koreans where they had agreed that they would give up and freeze their nuclear center, which had a nuclear reactor, had a nuclear processing facility to be able to extract the plutonium from the nuclear reactor spent fuel, and had everything associated with the entire fuel cycle, as we call it, for the nuclear business. However, by the time the Bush administration came into office, and I'll come back to that in more detail later on, they decided to kill this agreement. It was called the Agreed Framework. And this was in late 2002. In 2003, and in fact, it was exactly 20 years ago today, January 10th, 2003, the North Koreans withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They threw all the international inspectors out a few weeks before. And basically we thought they're going to build a bomb, but nobody knew exactly what they had done. The spent fuel that had been cooking in the nuclear reactor until 1994 had now been in storage until 2004. Nobody knew whether they had reprocessed it. And if they had reprocessed it, did they really get the plutonium out of there? So essentially, nobody knew much of anything. And they decided to show us all of this. And so here's a picture of the reactor, and overhead on your left, and the actual visit to the reactor operations room. And the reactor was operating. They restarted the reactor and were making more plutonium. We also went to the spent fuel pool where the previously cooked spent fuel had been sitting for 8 years. And that was really quite an adventure. But eventually they convinced me that the spent fuel was no longer in the pool. Then we went on and we went through their reprocessing facilities. What you see here are hot cells in which you can handle the very highly radioactive spent fuel and extract the plutonium. And I asked them everything about the plutonium chemistry, the Purex process. They knew everything, answered all my questions, and indeed had told me that, look, we've reprocessed all of that plutonium. And actually, some of you who heard my talks way back after this visit in 2004, 2005, and maybe in some of the future talks I also talked about it, when I expressed some skepticism that they actually reprocessed all of those spent fuel, extracted that plutonium, which is what they would need, to build the bomb. And the general sort of our assessment of how much they may have had in there is about 25 to 30 kilograms. In other words, maybe 5 or 6 bombs worth. And when I expressed skepticism, we were sitting in a conference room. They actually said, well, would you like to see our product? And I said, you mean the plutonium? And they said, well, yes. I said, well, yeah, I've seen a lot of plutonium in my lifetime at Los Alamos. First time when I was here in 1965 as a graduate student. And so they actually brought the plutonium out, and I wound up holding it in a sealed glass jar in my hand to make sure that it was heavy and that it was warm. And of course, the plutonium doesn't get out of the sealed glass jar, so I was really not in any danger. So they managed to convince me of that. And then from a policy or political standpoint, we met with the very high-level North Korean people, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kim Gik-wan. And whereas I thought they'd never let me into their country, they looked at it very differently. And they said, here is an opportunity. We got a guy who actually knows something about this nuclear stuff. And he will be able to carry our message back to the United States. And the message basically was, look, you walked away from this deal. We went ahead, we extracted the plutonium, we're building the bomb, and what they were really upset about, nobody seemed to care in the Bush administration at that particular time. And so they saw my visit, as Kim Gik-wan said here, to ensure some transparency. And then he actually said, Hecker's presence will allow us to tell you everything. This is an extraordinary approval, he said. Well, of course, they didn't tell me everything, but it was really quite remarkable as we walked through it. So the interactions with their technical people were very, very much like the interactions I'd had in the past with the Russians, with the French. And so that was very, very helpful. Here's Ambassador Lee Gun. He was head of the American Bureau. And at the end of the visit, after I was out at the nuclear center, he actually toasted me, actually with water and fruit juice is what we had. And he said, we've shown you our deterrent. And I said, no, wait a minute. You showed me probably what I saw was really the plutonium. But you not only need the bomb fuel, you need to have bomb design, you actually need to be able to weaponize this thing, and then you have to deliver it. And I didn't see these other two parts of what you need for a deterrent. However, certainly when I came back to this country, the message that I had, look, if they can make that piece of plutonium that I held, these guys can make the bomb. And indeed, when we got out of there, and the way you get into North Korea and back out, you actually have to fly in through China. So we flew to Beijing, then from Beijing on Air Koryo into Pyongyang. And as we were coming out in Beijing, we had 100 international news people all over us, and that's John Lewis on the right and myself on the left. So we got a lot of international attention for having been there. And here in the United States, I was asked to come and give testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Interestingly enough, the head of the committee was Senator Lugar. On the minority side was this guy by the name of Senator Joe Biden, who actually afterwards, he was really interested in all this, and he took me into their skiff and asked all kinds of questions. So it was very, very interesting. I gave my report as to what I saw, what my analysis was, and so forth. So second question is, why did they invite you back? So the best, and they did. In fact, I was there for 7 consecutive years in North Korea. And I answer that going all the way back to that first visit. And that is, we struck up a very good relationship, very professional relationship with the nuclear people, as well as with their diplomats. And the last night before I left, after I had been to the nuclear facility. I had dinner with the Vice Minister, and I said, Vice Minister Kim, I'm going to tell you everything now that I'm going to report back to our government when I get back to the United States. And so here's what I found. And I told them all this, you know, it looks like you've taken the spent fuel rods out of the pool, looks like you reprocessed it, looks like you got the plutonium. You know, however, I still have questions about, you know, whether you guys really have a deterrent or not. But here's what I'm going to say. And this is what I'm going to report in the United States. And then, of course, I put together a prepared statement for the Senate. And we sent the North Koreans through the UN mission. North Korea has a mission in New York for the United Nations. And we sent them a copy of the testimony that I gave because it was unclassified, and sent that to them. And so when I came back in 2005, they said, you said you were going to report exactly what you told us, you did that, and we respect that. And that respect essentially was kept through all of those 7 visits. So in other words, we had enough trust in each other that I thought they wouldn't give me a lot of BS as I go through their nuclear facilities. And they trusted me to report honestly what I saw. But they had to take the risk that my analysis might be somewhat different or might be something that they don't like, and they were willing to take that risk. So anyway, so that's why I went for the visits. And just to give you an idea, that next visit in 2005, that was all about the fact that North Korea was coming back and saying, actually by this time the Bush administration had re-engaged them, and North Korea said, look, we really were serious about the fact that Clinton administration had promised us that they would build light water, electricity producing reactors for us. And we want those. You know, and indeed, we have the right for peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and we have the right to exercise that right. And so they said, we don't have many natural resources. The reactors are really important to us. And we want to be able to have the peaceful nuclear energy applications. The Bush administration, although had very different views, and when I came back in 2005 from this particular visit, my colleague John Lewis had set up an appointment with Secretary of State at that time, Condoleezza Rice. She used to be one of his postdocs at Stanford many years ago. And whereas she was, more or less had thought that it wouldn't be, too terrible to have the North Koreans pursue the peaceful nuclear energy, the rest of the administration wanted to have nothing to do with that. However, Vice Minister Kim, for their side, no light water reactor, no deal. I'm going to show you a number of photos, and I have hundreds of photos. And actually, in addition to this book, we just today completed a website that complements the book. And the website has hundreds of photos because the photos in the book are just black and white. But John Lewis, with his experience in China and North Korea, realized that if you focus strictly on the nuclear issue and as to whether they ought to have a nuclear program or not have a nuclear program, you'll never solve the problem. You have to understand the country. You've got to understand what they're really after. And so always, in all of the visits, we got to see much of the rest of North Korea, including in this particular case, having this wonderful visit to the Children's Palace. We also went out, John always went out into the agricultural lands. Here was actually the Academy of Agricultural Sciences. So we went lots of places. So get to the question of which of the visits stand out. Well, that first one did, because it was really the one, for me, that formed the impression of North Korea. But the next most important one that really stands out was the last one in 2010. Actually, the 2009 visit, they showed us nothing. And when I asked them, at that particular time, look, what was the message you wanted me to send? And they said, well, the message you take back, you tell them we're out of here. Because again, that was a period of time from 2007, about February time frame, until early 2009, that there was some dialogue again. And actually, American technical teams had gotten back in there. The IAEA international inspectors had gotten back in there as well. But eventually, they were all expelled again. The North Koreans walked away. And in 2009, they said the message is, we want you to tell your government and the rest of the international news media that we're out of here. We're done with the dialogue. I said, this is a heck of a long way to come. I said, you tell them that. I don't need to tell them that. But by 2010, they had us back. And this time, they were really on the path to say that, look, we're going to build our own light water reactor. And for a light water reactor, we need an enrichment facility. And prior to this time, they had denied that they ever had any enrichment facility. They said we went the plutonium route to the bomb. Most of you know there are two routes, plutonium through reactors, uranium by enriching the natural uranium up to highly enriched uranium. So when they said that, that was really a significant visit. And the new reality was that now they had both paths to the bomb. And whereas the plutonium path to the bomb, because you have to make the plutonium in reactors, you can see whether the reactors are operating through overhead satellite imagery. You have a pretty good idea what's going on. So we have a pretty good assessment of how much plutonium. Enriched uranium, the centrifuge facilities, you can essentially put them in a basement, you can put in a garage, you can put in a building, we'll never know where they're there. And so nobody knew for sure, and lo and behold, they took us into the enrichment facility. In fact, let me back up. On the one on the left, they actually showed us the beginning of the construction of this light water reactor, which had not been seen by overhead satellite imagery before I got there. And then the centrifuge facility, they actually put in this building with the blue roof, which I had been in before for different purposes. It was a uranium workshop and not a centrifuge facility. They moved all of this in a period of about 18 months. And then they showed us something that looked a lot like this. This time, they didn't allow me to take photos anywhere. But it was a modern centrifuge facility. They said it had 2,000 centrifuges, which was about right. Would give them the capacity, if they used it all, to make highly enriched uranium, making about 40 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. For highly enriched uranium, that's more or less sort of 2 bombs worth. And so that was, again, a blockbuster of a visit with lots of international attention, and that's the way they sent their message out. And you would say, well, they used me to send that message. Yes, they did. But on the other hand, I'm essentially the only guy that has been in those facilities to get any sense of what they actually have. And of course, that I reported out as well as telling them. But again, in the spirit of John Lewis, to get around, look at the rest of the place, we also went to, in this particular case, Kim Il-sung University. And you might recognize those. For those of you who swim in the Blue Whale, the aquatic center, this is a lot like, except fancier than the Blue Whale. It was just absolutely beautiful. And so it was interesting also to see the computers at Kim Il-sung University. Kim Il-sung was the founding, the grandfather of the Kims. We also went, they had celebration with the Polish embassy in Pyongyang. In this particular case, it turned out to be the 92nd anniversary of Polish independence, and this young lady played beautiful Chopin. We went around the various factories, in this particular case, a textile factory. And lo and behold, as I was listening, and I have difficulties hearing, so I said, I can't believe this. Is this really American rock music that I'm hearing? And so I asked John Lewis, said, yes, it was American rock music. So I asked my interlocutors, how can you have American rock music? He said, that's what the women wanted to hear. And so that's what we put on. I actually have a video of this also, of the rock music playing in the textile factory. Okay, next question is, so how come no invitations after 2010? That was my 7th and last visit. I guess my bottom line is they didn't need me anymore. They had sort of gotten the main message across when it came to uranium, came to plutonium, and now they used other means to send their message. For example, they would show on their news media outlet, KCNA, they would go ahead and show Kim Jong-un, in this particular case, visiting a factory that makes, this is a flow-forming machine that makes the rotors for centrifuges. And they would actually go farther than that. In 2013, they actually showed us what they said was their bomb. Some Americans call them the disco ball. Not only did they show us this round thing, but you can see the missiles in the background. So, you know, the message was not lost. That, hey, we've got something that's reasonably small, about the same diameter as Kim Jong-un's waist at that time. And so you can measure that, you know, maybe 50, 60 centimeters or so. And they can fit in those missiles, so that's pretty impressive. That was in 16. In 17, actually, just before they tested their 6th test, and so far that's been their last, although they've been prepping for another one for some time. And here they actually released these photos just before they did the test on September 3rd, 2017. And that test appears to be in the 200 plus kilotons. So it most likely was a hydrogen bomb. And in their news announcement, they said that's what this is. So they showed this photo, said, you know, we tested a hydrogen bomb. And in fact, what was interesting, and of course, again, they have a missile behind it, which could house such a hydrogen bomb. Whether that's what they actually tested or not, we don't know. Now, again, I didn't go over there anymore after 2010, but what I learned, both from what I saw and from the discussions that I had, allowed me to do a pretty good analysis as we've gone on from that time frame to today as to what North Korea actually has and what we can expect. And what was interesting, you know, in this photo, this person over here showing the this device to Kim Jong-un is none other than the director that I had met several times during my visits to Yongbyon. And not only that, but he became a national hero. And here he is. I'd never seen him in army uniforms and medals. He was always dressed in suits. But here he is with Kim Jong-un after the successful 2017 test. So in other words, they didn't need me because they showed themselves what they had actually accomplished. With the missiles, it was even easier. Kim Jong-un was there for, you know, most of the big-time missile launches. For example, here's one where they said they had a submarine launch capability, although this one, I think we're quite sure, was actually launched from an undersea platform. And then they showed this, where they showed multiple missiles. Again, the message is clearly to the Americans, look, we can fire missiles from any place, you know, anywhere, and any time. And most of these are reasonably short range, but then also, after they did the big nuclear test in November 2017, then they actually were able to launch successfully an ICBM, and I've got all the data on there. The bottom line is they launched it in what's called a lofted trajectory. So in other words, high, rather than long. If they would straighten it out, that could reach most of the United States. And again, not to make sure that nothing gets lost on the Americans, they'd also show Kim Jong-un, in this particular case. This was a slimmed down Kim Jong-un, where he is right here. And they showed him with all of these different missiles, and cruise missiles and other missiles, short range, long range, and others. I mean, really an impressive array of launch capabilities. And then just a couple of months ago, they not only showed us that, not only showed off, now not only this one that I just showed you, the Hwasong-15, but they shot off a much bigger missile yet, and that was the Hwasong-17. And he brought for the first time his daughter out of hiding, and here in public. And here's his daughter, who is believed to be around between 10 and 11 years old. And this Hwasong-17 missile, by the way, is 84 feet high. So it is one huge monster that can reach anywhere in the United States. Again, they've never launched one, the full spectrum. And then, again, they've shown us enough that we can actually put together a pretty good assessment of all the different missiles they had and what their capabilities are. Okay, so let me then turn to the question of how did they do this? How did they become a nuclear power? And again, here, let me just tell you, you've got to read the book. But here's sort of a shorthand version, is that initially, as they came out, from the time that North Korea and South Korea was actually divided after the Second World War, and they came out, and North Korea was quite powerful for many years, even though it was almost totally destroyed during the Korean War. But then later in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was economically ahead of South Korea. But by the 1980s, it became clear their economy, much like the economy of the Soviet Union, was suffering terribly. Their conventional military power had eroded. And so nuclear weapons became much more important. Another advantage, of course, the atoms for peace. We helped many countries around the world to develop civilian nuclear technologies. By the way, that included Iran, in the 1960s, 1970s. Well, the Soviet Union helped the North Koreans, strictly for civilian use, but of course the technology is for the most part interchangeable, and so that helped them. And whereas the Soviets helped to build the first research reactor, and some of the North Koreans went and worked in the Soviet nuclear civilian facilities, then Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans decided in the 1970s and 80s to go ahead and develop sort of the alternative path also for military capabilities. A lot of people think the Russians or the Chinese must have given them the military capabilities for the nuclear technologies. They did not, as it turns out. They did indeed help them on the missile front. Again, one way or another, because the North Koreans were very, very clever. They got the first Soviet missile technologies actually from the Egyptians, rather than directly for the Soviets. But they had help over the years from Russia and also from China. They were expert in the black market, managed to get a lot of things from people like A.Q. Khan from Pakistan. And I would say, unlike the Soviets and the Russians, which had world-class scientific capabilities, theirs were adequate, but certainly not world-class. But they had excellent engineering capabilities. And then, from that time on that I'd already mentioned, where they had civilians started to develop the military, from that time on, and then particularly from the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they have followed what I call this dual-track strategy. And that's what I build up, and I try to demonstrate that in the book. Dual track essentially being, hey, look, we're serious about diplomacy. And Kim Il-sung, the great leader, was serious about diplomacy as the Soviet Union dissolved. Because at that time, both in Russia and China recognized South Korea, and North Korea just felt abandoned. And at that time, Kim Il-sung actually said, "Look, perhaps we're better off with the Americans." And so he started to seek normalization, or sort of a strategic accommodation with the Americans. In other words, taking diplomacy seriously. But they're, of course, also very paranoid and don't really have much help in the world. So they wanted to make sure that they had a hedge, and that was the dual track. So they followed the dual track. Sometimes diplomacy would lead, sometimes just weaponization would lead, and which depended on what was happening in the rest of the world and also what was going on domestically. So that's what they did, and it turns out they had a lot of help from Washington, because for 30 years we've had failed policies with North Koreans, different presidents, the same results. President Clinton actually came the closest, but then he couldn't quite finish it up. And so he made this deal, they froze the facilities, but they kept the hedge during that time. But they didn't have any weapons, at least that's my opinion. And then President Bush came in, and he and his colleagues, and I'll say more about that in just a minute, they were determined not to let that agreed framework stand. They were determined to kill it. So, however, what does he have to show for what he did in his 8 years? Well, they built the first nuclear bombs, they tested the first nuclear bombs, and by the time he went out of office in 2009, they probably had around 6 or so nuclear weapons. President Obama came in, and again, I'll tell you more when I come to the hinge points, but in the end, nothing ever worked out, and he failed just as badly for different reasons, and by the time he went out of office, they had 20 to 25 bombs worth of bomb fuel. And by that time, they'd done successful missile tests. You know, President Trump came in, fire and fury, followed with summits, took diplomacy to the highest level, and then was unable to follow through. And so that ended with a huge disappointment at the Hanoi summit, and with about 45 nuclear tests. So none of those administrations, particularly after Clinton, ever believed that North Korea was serious about diplomacy and about normalization with the United States. So I can demonstrate a bit more with focusing on 3 of what I call these hinge points. In other words, key turning points where events happened and either the North Koreans or the US had to make a decision. The first, and I think the most consequential, was when the Bush administration killed the agreed framework. I mentioned Clinton had signed this deal, and both the Clinton administration was slow and the North Koreans were slow to react to the opportunity they had in 1999 and 2000. They got as close as these photos, and that is the highest ranking military official, Vice Marshal Cho, came to the US. Actually, Bill Perry, my colleague at Stanford, invited them out to Stanford and to the West Coast, came to the White House to meet with President Clinton. A month later, Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, was there with Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, that is the father. And they signed this joint communique where they actually said, hey, we're going to build a relationship free from past enmity. But this was October 2000. And, you know, a month later, George W. Bush won the election, and that deal was gone. So we never got there. And in fact, what happened, Bush and the hardliners, particularly from Vice President Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and then especially John Bolton, who at that time came into the State Department. They did not believe that North Korea would do anything, but lie and cheat, and that what we needed was regime change. And what had happened while they had frozen the nuclear facilities in which American teams were over there, and so they were able to actually establish that was true through 2002. There were already signs in the late 1990s that the hedge that the North Koreans were keeping was to explore this centrifuge business, the uranium enrichment business. And Clinton administration knew that. They decided to sit on that for the time being and continue to go down the path of this agreed framework. The path was to build them 2 light water reactors in return for them permanently getting rid of their Yongbyon, what are called gas graphite reactors, which are much better for making plutonium than for making electricity. And so when the uranium enrichment information then hit the news during the Bush administration, then here's the statement from John Bolton. He said, that was the hammer that we needed to shatter the agreed framework. Because when they came into office, they were determined not to work with the North Koreans, but instead to look for a change in regime. And actually, let me go back for a second. It turns out the reason that was a disastrous hinge point is what happened after the Americans shattered the agreed framework. The North Koreans threw out the inspectors, restarted their reactor, reprocessed the plutonium, invited me to show me, and build a bomb. And they built a bomb in a year or less. Whereas uranium enrichment, they were at a level it would have taken them 10 years before they could build a bomb. So that's not a technically informed risk management decision. And it came to haunt us. President Obama came in, you might remember, to countries like Iran and North Korea. He says, I will hold out my hand if you unclench your fist. Well, the day he gave his big speech about getting rid of nuclear weapons, April 5th of 2009, shortly after he got into the office, he gave that speech at Prague. The North Koreans had launched a satellite only a few hours before that. That satellite was actually a satellite launch, but of course we called it a missile launch. It failed, but Obama was then convinced also that the North Koreans could not be trusted, that they had this cycle of provocation, extortion, reward, and his administration really never engaged North Korea seriously or terribly effectively. Again, the hinge point part was, by this time, when he came into office, the inspectors were actually allowed back into Yongbyon. The reactors had been shut down again. And when he walked away because they launched a satellite, then the North Koreans threw the inspectors out, restarted their reactor, and the program was back in full speed again. So you weren't willing to take a risk as to what did this satellite launch really mean? How far did it get them towards the nuclear weapon option? And you cut the connection, and they went back and put it in high gear. Again, bad decision. The next hinge point that I cover here, I have more of them in more details, of course, in the book, is when Trump came in. And in fact, that 2017, was an absolute disaster. It was Trump in the making of a nuclear crisis. At the UN General Assembly, he said, we'll have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea, and that Rocket Man was on a suicide mission. Kim's reply was, I will tame that mentally deranged dotard with fire. And so what we had, I thought, was captured well by a cartoon in The Economist, is we had 2 countries on hair trigger. And it was Kim Jong-un, we knew nothing about at that time. Trump, we knew something about, and at least for my taste, I didn't like what I knew. And so that scared the daylights out of me. We have a guy who knows nothing about nuclear business, knows nothing about foreign relations, and we have him going out against the person who we know nothing about at all. And so these guys on hair trigger, that's a bad time. However, within less than a year, they sat together in Singapore and signed this particular declaration, which actually was a superb piece. It was very brief, not much detail, but it said we're going to normalize, which is what the North Koreans have wanted all along. And you got to denuclearize, because that's what the Americans have wanted. So it's a huge step in the right direction. Then the idea was, okay, now we have to put details together. Well, those details, it turns out, didn't work so well. And to a large extent here, it was the North Koreans also took the wrong path. In this case, Trump actually had a negotiator, a diplomat, a guy by the name of Steve Biegun, who was an excellent diplomat, really understood what had to be done in order to work with the North Koreans. And the North Koreans, because of the Trump and Kim connection, then decided they would only deal at the top. They didn't need to do anything, do the homework to get everything ready down below. So that's where the North Koreans went astray. Where the Americans went astray is John Bolton got to work. So by this time, John Bolton is back in the US administration. He's actually back as National Security Advisor. And again, in the book, I demonstrate how John Bolton was just able to play on Don Trump, to have Don Trump believe that in spite of the fact that he actually liked Kim Jong-un, he thought he could arrange something with Kim Jong-un, that it was better for himself, Don Trump, to walk away from this summit, where the North Koreans had agreed again to freeze the young nuclear operations, and instead they walked away. What I show in the lower left, Madam Che, and she was Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Minister, Lee Young-ho, and they, in a midnight news conference, just laid out how devastating it was for Trump to walk away. Curiously, Trump received accolades across the political spectrum in the US, saying he was right to walk away rather than to go for a bad deal. I wrote an article shortly thereafter, and I said, but was he really? And my view was, it was a hinge point. Kim was humiliated, and US diplomacy was dead. Again, it was one of those cases, and I try to develop it in detail in the book. And I actually show in detail, there were these letters, Trump called them love letters, that he was writing with Kim Jong-un. I, for the most part, had dismissed those letters. I was going to say, what in the world is Trump actually going to write? And what's Kim going to put in there? Well, it turns out one of my colleagues that's worked with me in North Korea managed to get access to those letters. And they were very serious letters from Kim Jong-un. And actually not so bad from Trump's standpoint either. So these guys had an incredible opportunity to make progress towards moving North Korea away from nuclear weapons. Would we have ever gotten there? We don't know that for sure. But again, we didn't stay long enough. Take the risk that was technically manageable in order to find out. Okay, I'm getting near the end. How dangerous is their arsenal today? Well, I sort of list the key aspect. How much plutonium, how much highly enriched uranium, tritium, the stuff that you need for a hydrogen bomb. What about nuclear devices? Well, they have enough of the fissile materials, the bomb fuel, for perhaps up to about 55 or so bombs today. But very little tritium, and so very few hydrogen bombs. Can they deliver these nuclear warheads to Japan and to South Korea? My view is yes, I think they can. Can they deliver them to the United States or even to Guam, intermediate range? I don't think so yet. But the longer we don't connect with them, the longer they go off by themselves, the more likely they are to get there. And so what we have today then, how dangerous are they? Well, there are only 3 countries in the world that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons. 3. Obviously Russia, China, and North Korea, this little bitty thing, of 25 million people with a GDP of almost nothing, and yet they can threaten the United States. So, what now? Well, we have Kim Jong-un, he's built a really big one. He hasn't fired it in a normal trajectory yet. What did he say just as Trump was going up in 2021 at his Workers' Party plenum? He said, dialogue with the US is over. We better prepare for long-term confrontation with the US. Greatly enhance our forces, and you folks, we're going to have to tighten our belt. What he said on January 11th, when he received a birthday greeting, had just received the birthday greeting. His birthday is presumably January 8th. I received a birthday card from Trump. In North Koreans said, that was very nice. We have very good personal feelings about President Trump. However, the affairs of state take precedent over these personal feelings. And we're going to go our own way. Okay, in, of course, came President Biden. And here's just, I know it's hard to see, but if you look at this axis, this is the number of missile tests. 10 down here, 90 up here. And they sort of go along, up here about 20 or so. And then in 21, 10 or 11. And then this, in 2022, 80-some missile tests. And so they've really gone off to try to perfect their capabilities of launching the missiles. So this year, then just a couple of weeks ago, Kim Jong-un at his party plenum said, hey, look, we're going to increase the production exponentially. Well, it turns out, exponentially is like that. They can't do that because you can only make so much plutonium in that little reactor per year. But, certainly serious about building up. They're going to develop a new ICBM. This would probably be a solid rocket motor ICBM. And we're going to launch a military reconnaissance satellite. And they've also, in developing their nuclear policy, is we're going to have these nuclear weapons, not only for nuclear deterrence, but if we need them to keep our country safe, we'll have them for the second mission if we have to strike first. And we show this big was on 17 on the left, and then a number of the shorter range missiles here that they showed off on the right. And then, now we get, so what about now? And I've just told you that my belief was that starting around 1990 or so, with Kim Il-sung saying, perhaps we'd be better off with the United States than with the Chinese or with the Americans. Because in the end, the North Koreans really hate the Chinese. And the Russians, at least since the breakup of the Soviet Union, really have done very little for the North Koreans. So each one of them, at various times, was really serious about trying to come to this accommodation, including Kim Jong-un in 2018 and 2019. But everything that we can put together in 2022, it looks like Kim Jong-un is going in a different direction. And if you look on February 4th, 2022, there was the big Putin and Xi summit, a partnership with no limits. And it looks like North Korea is looking more and more to say, perhaps the United States is not the place to really look to the future. And we need to close ranks with the Chinese and with the Russians. And even in terms of the Ukraine situation, North Korea has put the blame on the Ukraine situation directly on the United States. As to how much they've actually supported the work in Ukraine, that's not at all clear. There's been a lot of rhetoric, but I'm not sure. Iran certainly has with their drones. And so, in essence, that's where we are today. So whereas I was reasonably optimistic for 20-some years, that we might get to the right place where we could actually come to some accommodation with the North Koreans. Because in the end, they can't eat nuclear weapons. And from an economic standpoint, they need to have interactions with the world, and the road to the world is mostly through the United States. So it doesn't look very good right now. However, in the past, the North Koreans have always proven to be pragmatic, quick on their feet, ready to change after, Trump's fire and fury and Kim's dotard remark. I never thought they're going to be able to get back there, but they did. They got back together in Singapore, and they almost got there in Hanoi, except Bolton, I think, to a large extent, was just too clever. So that's where we are today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening to me, and don't hesitate to go out and buy this book when it finally does come to the Historical Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
I'll be happy to entertain questions. Let's see, you've got people with microphones from what I understand, right?
We do.
Okay, there's Sarah in the back with microphones, so don't hesitate, raise your hand. She'll come around with the microphone and I'll see if I can hear and we'll try to answer. On the styles.
What
Hey,
is...
Leon, how are you?
Okay, nice to see you. What is Biden doing today with regard to North Korea?
Yeah, sure. I should have elaborated a little bit. The question is, what's Biden doing today as far as North Korea is concerned? I think the fair answer is nothing. I didn't make a big point of it, but as you might imagine, because coming from the lab, I've had access to the folks in Washington, and so each one of those administrations, I've been to them, I've interacted with the White House, with secretaries of states and so forth. And I was actually in with Secretary Blinken back in June, which I thought was a good sign that he was actually asking, hey, what do we do? And before they came into office, I sent them a little PowerPoint presentation, and I said, hey, look, one of the most important things is get out there quickly with the North Koreans. Make some moves quickly as to what you can do. And for a variety of reasons, early on, they were slow to react. As most administrations say, we're going to do a policy review. That takes 3 or 4 or 5 months, and that's already a long, long time. And then things just started to go to pots in the whole world. And especially, starting February 24th of this year with Ukraine, they absolutely, totally had their hands full. And so somehow they're sort of hoping, and I think keeping their fingers crossed, that nothing will happen over there. But, what happens in Ukraine, of course, is just an absolute disaster. I particularly, I must confess that when I see the daily bombing and the apartments coming down in Ukraine, it turns out I was born 20 kilometers from the current Ukrainian border in a little town called Tomaszew-Lubelski in Poland. My father was stationed in the German army. He was working in Lviv at that time. And so, and I went back there a few years ago with my wife Nina, and I look at those people suffering, and I understand how important that is. But for heaven's sakes, there are all these other things, and the North Korea situation needs attention, and just very little has been done. Hello, Ryan.
Hi, Sig. Do you see any parallels between North Korea and Iran as far as having an agreement and then throwing out the agreement? It seems like that, Obama had an agreement with Iran and Trump threw it out.
Yeah, so I've actually spoken in the past in this forum on both North Korea and Iran and comparing it. So if I understand the question right, so certainly as far as Obama was concerned, he decided very early on that he would put his effort into Iran for a whole number of reasons, some of which he's discussed at least in the first volume of his book, and that he thought he had an opportunity, and then they did make that agreement. So if you're asking in terms of sort of analogies, so Clinton had a deal with North Korea, then Bush came in, right? And so Obama had a deal with Iran, and then Trump came in, and they both killed it. So that's a very good analogy. I mean, that's what happened. There were two presidents, in Clinton's case, who at least thought there was a pretty reasonable idea he'd have a chance to do something with North Korea, and Obama felt that way with Iran. So I think the analogy might sort of stop there, because in North Korea's case, my view is Clinton could have pulled it off. My colleague Bill Perry, who was former Secretary of Defense, who actually ran a process called the Perry process for the Clinton administration, he actually thought that if Clinton would have gone to North Korea, and by the way, Clinton was thinking about going to North Korea at the very end of his tenure, that he could have solved the problem, that could have gotten us over the hump. And then, for reasons that Clinton actually discusses in his books, he was held up by thinking that he's going to go to Palestine. Eventually, he didn't wind up going to Palestine or to go to North Korea, and everything fell through. So I think on the other hand, in the Iranian, Clinton believed that he had something that he could actually bring to fruition with the North Koreans, and I personally think that's also true. In the Iranian case, when the deal was made, the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in 2015, I said, well, you know, there are a lot of things that are not so great with this, but it's probably the right step to keep Iran from the bomb now and to move them farther away. However, what was demonstrated later, actually, by Netanyahu, was they were able to get into Tehran, do this enormous heist of nuclear weapons information on the Iranian program, and took it back to Israel. And there are colleagues of mine that have studied that. And the main difference then is quite frankly, with the Iranians, I don't think we have much chance. As long as the Ayatollahs are there, we don't have a chance to go with them. So now what to do in terms of getting back, and of course Biden has considered that. That's also faltered because there's just, you know, there's so many other things on the table, and then Iran has now clearly shown that it's on the side of the Russians, you know, supporting the Russians with the drones that are killing Ukrainians. So there are some similarities, but then some great differences.
As this SIG, on both sides, both on the American side and on the North Korean side, could you sort of characterize how much domestic politics has affected this process versus the concerns of international peace?
Yeah, for the North Korean side or both?
For both.
Oh, yeah. Much more so on the Iranian side. You know, as you've seen with the recent demonstrations, which didn't have anything to do with the JCPOA or with the Americans, but it had something to do with the fact that that regime is just deadly in terms of human rights, and then particularly deadly in terms of how it treats women. And so the domestic politics in Iran are hot and heavy inside, and didn't have all that much to do with the Americans. There were a few times when the Americans took some actions, like killing one of the main commanders from the Revolutionary Guard, where the Iranian domestic situation was such where they supported their regime against the terrible Americans. So you see some of that, but in Iran, I can see domestic politics and situation potentially playing a significant role. And I could actually see the possibility that perhaps because of the domestic issues, it would actually push the regime out, and you have some sort of a change of regime because of the domestic turmoil. In North Korea, the domestic issues play much, much less of a role. And even though, again, the North Korean government as such, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, I mean, they're dictators. You know, their human rights record is absolutely terrible. And their people are, you know, just heavily constrained in every which way. But I do not see a sort of an internal revolution there having. In terms of the nuclear weapons, the regime, you know, the Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un very much play up the nuclear weapon program as necessary to defend them. And so to some extent, I would say in North Korea, probably generally, the public supports the nuclear weapons program. Whereas in Iran, I think you would have much more question than that. I hope I answered your question. Yes?
So I have recently been reading that China has been building up its nuclear arsenal with bases in western China, several hundred missiles. Given the historic enmity between China and Korea, do you think this could be influencing current developments in Korea?
Yeah, so if I understood correctly, you said China is building up its own program recently, right? And does that influence North Korea? Yeah, of course, the China-North Korea situation is really, you know, closely tied together. The China situation is really another whole talk. You know, it's really a complicated issue. I've also, you know, I've been to China 39 times. I've worked closely with the Chinese nuclear weapons establishment, and for many years, I actually thought, you know, they had a pretty sensible approach, and they essentially said, we're not going to spend ourselves into the poorhouse by building all these nuclear weapons. We're going to build some number, and the best that we knew a few years ago, they had a couple of hundred you know, weapons, deliverable weapons, and maybe a few dozen ICBMs. And they said, hey, look, as long as the US doesn't have an effective ballistic missile defense, that's enough to provide the deterrent. And we don't need to spend money any more than that. And that, with Xi Jinping coming into power in 2013, and then building up and still benefiting from the enormous economic increase, essentially what he's decided to do, from the best we can tell, is, look, we've got the money, we've got the economy, we're going to get more weapons. And so they are building up. How that buildup affects North Korea, I think that's a second order effect. It's not a first order effect. The North Koreans really don't see that the Chinese are going to come to their rescue. And in fact, having to depend on the Chinese really makes the North Koreans very nervous. That's why even back 30 years ago, they actually thought they might be better off with the Americans. The Americans are far enough away, you know, the Chinese are next door, and we're nothing going to be like only the little brothers, and they're always going to have the heavy hand on us. And so I think that's still there today, except, as I said at the very end, with Russia, China, you know, having gotten together the way they did, that North Korea may just look at both of them as that being a better bloc to be associated with than the US. Of course, what comes into play in all of this is, well, what about South Korea? Can South Korea and North Korea somehow reconcile? And depending on which administration you have in place, in South Korea, the answer is maybe or no. In the previous administration with President Moon, he made it very, very clear that he can accommodate the North. And essentially what he was looking at was an economic integration between the North and the South, keeping two separate governments. With the current President Yoon, it's very, very different. So back to much more of a hard line, and that's again one of the reasons why the North Koreans are saying what they are. But in the end, even if we, the Chinese or the Russians, in the end, it's really the North and they have to solve their own problem. They're North and South. We just have to, I'd like to see us be able to move the nuclear stuff out of the equation and then allowing them to come to whatever reconciliation there might be.
Thanks so much for doing this. This has been very interesting. I've spent most of my career working on chemical weapons issues, and so, been working for the OPCW the last few years. There was a lot of excitement a few years ago. We thought there was a little window of opportunity to work with North Korea on bringing them into the Chemical Weapons Convention. And a lot of people thought that that would be a possible way to demonstrate to them that this kind of arms control treaty could work for them, and then use that as a jumping off point for further work on nuclear issues. I guess I'd be curious to hear whether you think those kinds of efforts in other areas would really be beneficial, or is it just wishful thinking?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow.
Okay.
Which the arms?
So working with them on chemical weapons issues, would that kind of effort and those kinds of successes potentially have any benefit in the discussions with North Korea on nuclear issues? Do you think those kinds of things would provide some kind of incentive for them to go farther in other areas?
Yeah, so again, if I understand it, right now, nothing works. And in essence, since Biden administration, as I said, was a little bit slow, actually they were quite slow, and so North Korea made their own decisions, and in essence, the best way to describe, they're not answering the phone. So when I talk to the folks back in the White House and I say, why don't you guys do this? And they said, they won't answer the goddamn phone, they don't want to talk. And so right now, nothing works. But yes, those are precisely the sort of things that had a chance to work before. And by doing those, you actually get the North Koreans into a situation where if you have some of those kind of dealings, they would have much more to lose, if they went back again in the other direction. That was the beauty of this agreed framework that I personally never understood that I went to North Korea. That the deal in 1994, that we with the North Koreans, we would, for the North Koreans, with South Koreans and Japanese, build them these two big light water reactors. And at that time, still Los Alamos said, that's dumb. How's that going to fit into their grid and so forth? But the thing is, suppose they could have gotten those reactors working. And that country is electricity starved. And those reactors would have been supplying, 2 gigawatts worth of electric power. The North Koreans would have thought 2 or 3 times before they did something stupid and turned that off. So in other words, you got to get the skin in the game, and anything you can do in these other directions does that. And that's what my colleague John Lewis was after. And I had to, learn by going with him. So very, very good question. And maybe one
I thoroughly enjoyed all your talks, Dr. Henry. I enjoyed seeing you in PF4 all the years I worked there. I wonder if you see North Korea, Russia, and Chinese through the lens that I see them. None of those 3 men have a pension or retirement plan. Their pension or retirement plan, if they're lucky, is a soft bed when they die or a bullet in the neck quickly. So do you see that the way we're talking about negotiating with them might be changed due to that type of situation? That's one question. Two is, open source, I see that certain allies of the United States are the ones that sold the graphene impellers to Iran. Is that covered in your book? I've appreciated the way you've been honest with all the other topics. Thank you very much.
Todd, I'm afraid you're going to have to help me out. Why don't you come up, help me out, and at least give me the essence of that question. I couldn't quite.
The impellers for the centrifuges in Iran, I heard they came from a
Can you understand them, Todd? No. Yeah, for some reason.
The second question is the impellers in all the Iranian centrifuges. I've heard they've come from a friendly country, an ally of ours. Is that covered in your book? And the first question is, given that these three dictators aren't living on the same planet as we are, they're gonna either die in place or be murdered. Do you think we have to take that in consideration when we're negotiating with them? Does that make sense? I'm sorry.
So as far as the, Sarah, can you help me with that? So so just to let you know, when I tell my students, when I give lectures and talk to them, I tell them that, hey, look, you got to speak clearly and speak up because my hearing is electronically assisted. And so sometimes it gets sufficiently distorted, and I'm afraid that was. So Sarah's going to help me because I do want to be able to answer the question.
So the first one was, given that the leaders of Russia, North Korea, and I forget, China are dictators, and he said, living on a different planet from us, how does that affect how we negotiate them? Considering they're gonna, what you said, die in place or be taken over, coup? Like, how does that play into that negotiation?
So that one's sort of beyond my pay grade. Yeah, you know, I think about these things all the time. What do you do with these guys? And it turns out, right now, I would consider the Kim being among the easiest ones to deal with. They are dictators. You know, they're terrible in terms of human rights. But I think you could actually deal with them, discuss with them, you know, have negotiations, and be able to do that. With Xi Jinping, it's tough because indeed he's taken China in a direction that's very different than his predecessors. But still, you have to be able to deal with Xi Jinping. With Putin right now, I consider that to be the most difficult, without question. I just don't know what one can do with Putin right now. He's on this mission in Ukraine, and he's doing it in such a way that he's not only upending the entire European security arrangement, but as I've actually spoken and have written on, he's killed the entire, what I call the global nuclear order, sort of what has allowed us to live in one way or another since 1945 without the use of nuclear weapons in war, without proliferation to dozens of countries, without nuclear being used by terrorists, and having the benefits of nuclear electricity. I don't see how we can deal with him in a rational manner anymore after what he's done with Iran. So what he's done with Ukraine. However, if you look carefully, as much as whatever you think our reactions are and what I just told you, there's at least a good part of half of the world, more or less what you could call the global south, which doesn't condemn Putin necessarily for what he does. And so, you know, I mean, the world has a serious challenge right now. And then, of course, all we have to do is look in our own backyard. And so as much as we have to worry about those tyrants, we damn well better get our own house in order before we try to fix others. Let me leave it at that. I'll be happy to answer other questions as we go out. So I thank you very much for your patience and